Well, hello and welcome to everybody who is joining us today for this webinar, which is the latest in a long-running partnership between the UK Political Studies Association, which is the learned society for the study of politics and government in the UK and around the world, and the Parliamentary Education Service, which has existed for a number of years now to promote the study of Parliament and all things political within it. Today's webinar is on the theme of theories of representation. And for those of you who have been to any of these webinars before, you'll know that the format includes two speakers, so one academic and one politician. And today we are very lucky to be joined by Professor Oliver Heath from Royal Holloway University, who's a professor of politics and co-director of the Democracy and Elections Centre there. And Oliver's going to talk about descriptive representation and what voters think about it and how does it matter, which you should hopefully be able to see on the headline slide that's already been put up on the screen. And after Oliver, we've got Valerie Vaz MP, who has been Member of Parliament for Walsall South since 2010. She's a Labour MP, former solicitor, and she's also served as shadow leader for the House of Commons until 2021. So the way in which this is going to work is that each of our speakers will give a short talk for roughly 15 minutes. Those of you in the audience will then have a chance to question our speaker, and then we'll move on to the next speaker and the format will remain the same. And we will aim to wrap up within an hour or so roughly. So hopefully we'll keep this fairly contained, short, snappy, and sweet for all of you. In terms of housekeeping, if you do have a question for one of our speakers, you can either post it in the chat whilst that speaker is presenting, and I will make a note of it and put it to them when they finish, or you can wait until they finish their talk, and then you can raise your hand and I will try to come to you and you can unmute and ask the question yourself. In terms of etiquette, please, as I'm sure you tell all of your students and I tell all of mine, when you're teaching online, keep yourselves muted unless you are asking a question. That's just common courtesy. And if you have any criticisms or complaints or useful feedback, please save those for the feedback form at the end of this session as well. All right, well, I think in that case, we will crack on and I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, Professor Oliver Heath.
Great. Thanks, James. Pleasure to be here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about descriptive representation from the voter's perspective. So my research on this topic has looked really about what voters think about descriptive representation with respect to gender and class in the UK context and religion and ethnicity more comparatively. But I'm going to start by talking about voters' preferences towards and attitudes towards descriptive representation in general, and then hone in a little bit more detail with respect to class, which is where a lot of my research has focused. So, my slides don't seem to be moving. Okay, great. So descriptive representation occurs where the representative or the MP stands for a group by virtue of sharing a similar characteristic. And substantive representation occurs when the representative seeks to advance that group's policy preferences. This is kind of like a well-known sort of conceptualization of representation that guides a lot of research in politics at the moment. So according to one influential perspective, socio-demographic dissimilarity with a political figure, so political leader or a candidate, tends to decrease a voter's expected utility from the election of that person. And part of the rationale for this is that in the eyes of the voter, there's a link between descriptive and substantive representation. So women are thought to be more likely to advance the interests of women. Working class people might be more likely to advance the interests of working class, and so on. And so from identity politics perspective, we might expect voters to prefer the election of candidates that come from their own background. However, research both in the UK and comparatively has tended to provide sort of mixed evidence on the presence of these effects. So work that I've done with Rosie Campbell on gender has found very limited sense in which women are more likely to vote for women and no sense in which men are less likely to vote for men. And similarly, research by Steve Fisher and colleagues has found very limited effects of any kind of co-ethnic voting or any co-sort of ethnic penalty. But this doesn't necessarily indicate that voters don't care about descriptive representation. It just means that in the current electoral system that we have of first past the post, it's a very high bar for voters to abandon their preferred party just purely on the basis of the demographic characteristics of the candidate in question. So what I wanted to start by doing is just to present an overview of citizens' attitudes towards the representation of sort of politically marginalised group in Parliament and compare that against candidates. So this was a study I did with Rosie Campbell a number of years ago where we interviewed candidates and voters. And you can see that across the board, voters and candidates want to see increased representation of a lot of sort of underrepresented groups, but there's variation across the sort of groups in question. So from the voters' perspective, the thing that they want to see more represented in Parliament is local MPs, working class MPs, and women MPs. From candidates' perspective, frontrunner is addressing gender imbalance in Parliament, but then also increasing the representation of local and working class MPs as well. So this is kind of like a broad sense in which Parliament should become more representative, but it doesn't necessarily tell us about preferences for descriptive representation, because for that we've got to match which groups voters want to see represented against the sort of social background that they themselves possess. So what these figures are showing is in the columns down the side of the figure is the social background of the voter or the political candidate, and the columns across the figures are the group in question and whether they would like to see those people represented more in Parliament. And we do see these strong preferences for descriptive representation. So women are more likely than men to want to see more women in Parliament. Working class people are more likely than middle class people to want more working class MPs in Parliament. Young people want to see more young MPs, and so on. So that there is a kind of preference for descriptive representation. But I don't think we can reduce it to this either, because we can see that some groups want to see the representation of all marginalised groups increased, particularly women, that you'll see that they want to increase not only the representation of women MPs, but also working class MPs, young MPs, ethnic minority MPs, and Christians and Muslims as well. And candidates in particular are much more likely to want to see the increased representation of these groups than voters. But where we do see particularly strong effects, I'd say, is respect to class and religion, where we see these very strong desires for increased descriptive representation. And class is the sort of topic that I've spent most of my time focusing on. So just wanted to sort of like unpack a little bit what's going on there. So this slide really tries to answer that question of, do voters see a link between descriptive and substantive representation? If they do, they might be more likely to think that working class candidates are more likely to stand up for working class interests, which have typically been defined in terms of left-right, so sort of preference for more sort of redistribution, curbing rising inequality, more welfare spending, and that sort of thing. So what we've done here is we've done sort of what's called a conjoint experiment, where we present voters with fictitious candidates who are advocating a range of different policies, coming from a range of different backgrounds, and we see which factors have greatest impact on voters' perception of what general sort of policy space that candidate occupies. And so we see that the specific policies that candidates advocate makes a big difference. Yeah. So if candidates saying that immigration policy should be more restrictive, voters will say that that candidate is towards the right. If they're saying that they should be reducing taxes, voters will say that candidate is towards the right as well. But over and above these sort of explicit policy appeals, we do also see these kind of like social signals, and that working class candidates, over and above what they're saying about policy, are seen as much more left-wing than middle-class candidates. And we don't really see these kinds of effects with respect to age or gender, which don't send such a sort of strong policy signal, at least in terms of left-right placement, but maybe sending different signals. So in the eyes of the voter, there does seem to be this link between descriptive and substantive representation in class terms. So how does that then translate into preference? Are working class people more likely to support working class candidates? And this is what this graph, this figure, tries to depict. Again, we're trying to sort of isolate the effect of sort of social background or class background in this case, holding constant all the other things that politicians might be talking about about sort of specific policies on the environment, immigration, taxation, and Brexit. And what we find here is that the class background of an MP does send a very strong signal to working class voters, and that they're much more likely to prefer the working class candidate than middle class voters, even when they know what policies the candidate advocates. And on the same token, they're much less likely to support the middle class candidate. So descriptive representation in this sense clearly matters. It matters quite a lot over and above substantive representation, because we're already taking that into account somewhat with respect to the policy positions. And so it's sending some kind of sort of symbolic signal as well, perhaps to do with how well voters think politicians represent them more generally, or how close they may feel to them. So this is kind of like a snapshot of the findings. Some of this is work in progress, but I think the sort of key takeaways are that there is a link between descriptive and substantive representation, but it's not equally strong for all groups, either in practice in terms of how those groups act in Parliament, or in the eyes of voters. And this, I expect, is not a big surprise, and some groups might have much more heterogeneous sort of policy or issue preferences than others. What does seem to send a very strong signal, though, is the class background of MPs. And this relates both to how voters see politicians in a policy space, but also how they relate to them in terms of sort of class-based support. And I think this has some sort of important implications for how we think about sort of current sort of changes that have been taking place in British politics at the moment, with feelings that perhaps Parliament is becoming too sort of elite, out of touch with some sections of society. On the one hand, seen a quite marked decline of MPs from working class backgrounds, from non-university backgrounds over the last 30, 40 years, particularly on the Labour side of the House. And this can kind of fuel, I think, issues of sort of concern about representation that perhaps has been underpinning some of the developments around the rise of populism that we've seen. So that's the presentation from me, but yeah, very happy to expand on any of that or answer any questions.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Oliver. I don't know if you want to stop sharing your screen. Thank you. And then we can see everybody else as well. Just bring up my gallery. Brilliant. So that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. Great to see some of the findings from your own research as well. So we'll open the floor now to any questions for Oliver. And if you want to raise your hand, there is a little button at the bottom of your screen called reactions. And if you click the button in the right top corner of that box, you'll be able to raise your hand. And I can see that Alexander has raised his hand. So we'll come to you, Alexander.
Hi there. Really, really interesting stuff. One question we were asking is how recent was this survey, and have you seen maybe the last couple of years whether this sort of demographics is changing? Because one thing that jumped out to us quite a lot was the representation of the LGBT groups, and we thought that was surprisingly quite low, actually, given recent politics, particularly with recent pressure groups and things like that. So yeah, we're wondering some out whether recent trends that's changing, or would you say it's kind of stayed the same?
I think that's an interesting question. The survey itself that was carried out comparing candidates and voters took place before Brexit. So I think probably quite a lot has changed now in terms of the intake of MPs. I think then talking about sort of quite a different group of MPs to what has perhaps come into Parliament after Brexit, particularly on the Tory side. So there may well be some changes amongst the kind of like attitudes and the opinions of MPs and candidates. I'm not so, I wouldn't expect there to be such strong changes on the voter side of things. I think those kind of currents have been much more sort of slow moving and gradual. And the sort of second half of the presentation, where I was focusing particularly on class, is data fresh out of the field. So this is its first public airing of been just recently collected.
Interesting. And if I may ask one more very, very quick one, would you say perhaps the rise of some figures like, say, Nigel Farage and things like that have particularly had much of an impact? Because one of the arguments, obviously, with things like the rise of GB News and whatnot, is that, you know, whenever you see GB News, they're always talking about the establishment and trying to appeal to very much working class votes. So it's interesting to see whether the rise of, say, for lack of a better word, nationalists under Nigel Farage has had an interesting effect with Brexit as to whether people feel that politicians are out of touch. Yeah,
I think, again, that's a very good question. And it's one which is difficult to untangle the sort of cause and the effect. So is it kind of like contributing to, I mean, I think it probably is contributing to this kind of like anti-elite, sort of like anti-politics discourse, but it's probably only getting as much traction as it has because that kind of climate was already there to be exploited. I think in that sense, it is probably a product of its time that wouldn't have been so effective as a mobilization strategy sort of maybe 20 or 30 years ago, when that disconnect maybe wasn't quite so pronounced.
Brilliant. I can see we've got a hand up from Luke.
Hi, I'm not entirely sure my audio is working so well. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, cool. Thank you for that presentation. Really interesting stuff. I just wanted to check that I read the data correctly, the graph correctly. It seemed to me that the BAME and minority ethnic groups seem disproportionately to want better qualified, better academically qualified representation. Is that what we saw on there? It seemed that every group wanted their own group better represented, but it did seem that minority ethnic group representation, they seem to want better qualified, more degree level, more kind of better educated groups. Does that seem to bear out? Or have I misread that horribly?
I'm looking at the figures. So the ethnic minority voters do want to see more ethnic minority MPs and politicians in Parliament. So there is quite a strong effect there. There doesn't seem to be much of an effect on the increased representation of other groups. But I think if you look at the Muslim voters, there's kind of like that clear descriptive preference for wanting to see more Muslim MPs, but there's also a more kind of perhaps kind of like religious preference for seeing more Christian MPs as well, which I thought was one of the interesting things that came out of that.
Does that work in the opposite direction or not?
No,
I guess
no,
not.
it doesn't work in the opposite direction, no.
It's interesting. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you for that question, Luke. Any other questions for Oliver? Or while you're pondering, I'll ask Oliver a question. So, Oliver, our audience today are going to be thinking about how they go off and teach theories of representation to young people who we hope one day will teach in our university classrooms as well. What do you think are the key questions that our audience should be getting their classrooms to consider?
Well, I think a key question is about the link between descriptive and substantive representation. And I think there's a lot of interesting research that's been done in Parliament or on parliamentarians looking at this link and how it influences kind of like speech and sort of policy voting. So I think that's an interesting area to explore, but I don't think, again, it can be reduced purely to that. So when people are looking at kind of the representation of different social groups, I don't think it's really just a policy preference. It's something perhaps more sort of like identity based that perhaps doesn't feed into so much of the debate at the moment.
Brilliant. And oh, we've got a hand. Stuart, I'll come to you.
Thank you very much for your. My camera's not working, but your presentation was excellent. I just wonder whether you're noticing any differences in the way in which candidates are being selected for this next general election based on some of the things you talked about in representation. Is there any research done at the moment looking at how Labour particularly are selecting candidates for the next election?
I mean, I think one of the striking things that I've noticed, and I'm not sure how much this is informed by academic research versus policy practice, is this almost sort of obsession with local candidates. And I think they, you know, if you ask voters what they want, they will often say that they want local candidates. And this now seems to be taking, I'd say, an outsized role in the candidate selection process, where it's almost like non-local candidates aren't really being considered. And so that seems to be getting a lot of attention, but I'm not sure voters necessarily see it in such stark terms. I think, you know, people want a candidate that's got some connection to the constituency and are going to kind of do their best to try and represent that constituency. But I don't think that's necessarily the same thing as meaning that they should have been born there and lived there for sort of 30 years or so.
It was interesting because obviously I'm in Bedford, so we're very close to Nadine Dorris's constituency. We've just had the announcements of the three candidates, and Labour and Lib Dems are both going for the local candidate, and made a big thing about local. But the Conservatives are parachuting someone in who's actually the Bedford Police and Crime Commissioner, who doesn't live in Bedford, he lives in Luton. It'll be interesting to see his how he performs compared to the two local candidates.
Yeah, and what he says about his motivation for wanting to contest there, because I think you need to be able to tell a sort of like plausible story, isn't it? And construct a narrative in one way or another. And yeah, if you're lived there, that's a very easy one, but otherwise you sometimes need to think a bit more creatively.
Brilliant. Any final questions for Oliver before we move to our second speaker? Well, maybe one final question then from me, Oliver, was, do you have any sense of how these findings play out comparatively? So are we similar to countries in the rest of Europe in terms of what we want from, or who we want to see in our parliaments? Are we more like the US? Are any of those countries particularly different from us?
Yeah, there's a lot of comparative research, particularly in Europe now, looking at these kinds of questions of descriptive and social representation. And I think it does seem to be quite a common trend across Europe. The politicians are increasingly seen as being kind of quite elite, and then easy perhaps to portray them as being sort of out of touch with concerns of ordinary voters. And so, yeah, this preference from people from just like maybe more experience of, sort of like everyday work before entering Parliament is, yeah, quite a common phenomenon across Europe. And the project that I'm working on at the moment is a comparative study with people from Norway, and they're finding, yeah, very similar patterns there.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your presentation, Oliver. I'm sure you won't mind me saying that if anyone wants to get in contact with you about the research, they can find your details online on the Royal Holloway website.
Yeah, sure.
And also, please feel free to stay with us as well for the rest of this session. But now we'll turn to our second speaker, Valerie Vaz MP, who's a British Labour Party politician serving for Walsall South. And I believe Valerie was elected in 2010, if I've got that right. So I will hand over to Valerie to talk a little bit about representation from the other side of this kind of theory practice divide. So Valerie's going to speak for a little bit like Oliver did, and then you'll have the chance to put some questions to her. So without further ado, Valerie, please take it away.
Right, I've unmuted, just about got the hang of all of this. Apologies, I wanted to come in right at the start, and I did say to David that I wanted to be there right from the beginning so I could hear what Oliver had to say. So we had some votes, a couple of votes on the finance bill, so apologies for being late, but I picked up some of the questions, and David asked me to cover what it's like from, I suppose you've just heard the theory of representation, and I suppose I would give you the practice of representation, which I've just done in voting. And just to pick up the last point that I think Oliver made about local candidates, and I would absolutely agree with him. I think there's a tendency for people to feel that they should be local, but if you say you want to do something in politics and you're in a constituency where you've got one particular party, that shouldn't stop you from going to other constituencies. And I suppose that's part of the practice of representation. I mean, for me, I wasn't connected with Walsall at all. It was a last minute selection. It was still tough, but I managed to get through. And the practice is, I suppose, we start with a manifesto, which for me would be the Labour Party manifesto, and the same is true of everyone else. And we stand as candidates on that manifesto. So to that extent, that should really iron out the local issue. But when you get elected, it almost always falls back onto local issues, and I think, given what happened in 2019, and I did retain my seat against quite a big swing in the rest of the country. I did do something previously. I was a lawyer. I suppose, having been rebuffed so many times, I finally got selected and finally got elected, and I thought, this is my chance, I'm going to make the most of it. And slightly older than some of the people we see now. But I suppose everybody brings everything to representing their constituents in Parliament. And being a lawyer, I like doing the casework. There are some MPs who don't do the casework, they let other people do it. So I sign off all my letters, I speak to all the constituents, and I'm not sure whether, and again, I don't think of myself as representing someone when I do the casework. So my party politics comes out of it completely, except if I see an injustice and then I want to write it, and then there are mechanisms by which a member of Parliament can move things forward. So when you're elected, it's a kind of, you kind of say, I'm not elected as the Labour Party a member, I'm elected to represent everyone, whoever voted for me. And there are people who do come to me, who say, oh, I've never voted for you, but I'm still there to help them. It's changed slightly from the olden days, where people used to come in, they were probably barristers, and they used to use the House of Commons as a kind of like a gentleman's club, and they used to come and debate, and you never got called for a long time. You had to wait your turn, and then you made these long speeches, and you put everything in, and you didn't speak as often as you did. But we've now moved into a very kind of 24-hour cycle where there is a huge amount of pressure on us to be visible, to be seen, to be able to do things. And it's changed slightly now when people are making the arguments that, oh, look, the House of Commons is empty. But there are other places that we are where we can actually represent our constituencies. So we have select committees which play a vital function in questioning ministers. And there are bill committees that are not often televised. We have the televised chamber, so that's a very good thing. But there's lots of interesting things going on off screen. We also have all-party parliamentary groups that can also call ministers to account. So there are lots of other ways, as well as casework, of us representing our constituents. And it is a 24, for me, it is a 24-hour job, which really it shouldn't be, because it shouldn't exclude people. People shouldn't feel that they can't do the job because it's non-stop. But there are different pressures now, because every single thing you do, given, I mean, you only have to look at what's recently happened to the Prime Minister, that any conversation you have to accept that it's going to be recorded, and someone may use it in evidence against you, no matter where. So it is, the pressure is quite intense. And in terms of the practice of representation and what we say, and yet yes, we do have to abide by what the party stands for and our policy, and the same with ministers. But you get good ministers who are able to take your question and able to find something that they can respond back to you. It's not changing policy as such, but it's maybe helping out that particular constituent. And in case people don't understand or know what the kind of emails we get, which are many and varied, because there are lots of many different ways of contacting us, it can range from, I haven't got my blue badge, can you help me, to matters of policy like equal marriage. And I have people in my surgeries wanting to talk about policy, and for that someone came to me and says, I'm never going to vote for you ever again, after I explained to her why I couldn't support what she wanted, to vote against the equal marriage bill. And then I explained to her, and sometimes I just have to accept in the early days, and it changes as you go along, as you get more experienced. In the early days, I'd have been really nervous. Oh my gosh, I've lost a voter. But I felt that on matters of principle, on matters of party policy, that I need to explain what my position is. And most people will accept that. And also that it's much more than that one particular issue. And I think that's, if I'm looking forward to representation, what I think is happening now is we're becoming very much single issue, and they're expecting politicians to go beyond looking at cross-government issues. So they can't see, for example, that, so a policy on free school meals, for example, we have costed our policy on breakfast clubs, which we think targets people much more than if you do a blanket free school meals for everyone. And that the breakfast clubs was done on the basis that people who, the ones who needed it most, the parents who are doing double shifts or who are working early in the morning, can drop their children off at school, and that's what they wanted and that's what they needed, and that would target the ones who needed it most. But it needs explaining, and it's again now, it's how are we coming up with policies that will make society right again? Because I am concerned about the democratic process. I am concerned about how we are engaging with people. And it's getting much harder to do that basic door knocking where you could talk to people and that people always say to you, we never see you except at election time. And that's always not true. And we never hear from you. And even if you drop leaflets in, even if you just leafleted something, people will always say that to you. But I think it's the good part is that we are accessible in lots of different ways, by email, by website, so they know exactly what we're doing. And for me, constituency surgeries. Added to that, we get what I call policy emails. So they will ask us about wild animals and circuses, or it can be something like that, or something right at the other end. And what we have is we as Labour Party MPs have to abide by party policy, and we can't send out our own personal opinion. We have an answer which is agreed with the front bench, and then we can send it out. When I first came in, we were electing a leader, and we didn't really have any settled policy. I used to just say, in my view, this is what I think, and I consider this. So I wasn't sort of cutting across Labour Party policy. How do things change? I think we've moved in Parliament to, we're not as static as people think we are. It's not as fusty as people think we are. You can get fabulous answers from really good ministers if you ask written questions, which they have to answer in a few days' time. So it's a named day. And it can be on any subject. We have a wonderful table office. It's called the table office, and they actually help you to formulate a question to get the best answer out of a minister, out of the government. And that is another way of holding the government to account, because that principally is what our job is. We need to hold the government to account. We are Parliament, we are backbenchers, we are that third side of that golden triangle. There's the executive, judiciary, and us in Parliament. And so written questions are very good. Oral questions are excellent. You know the oral questions in the chamber. And then we have a chance to have debates, and we apply to Mr. Speaker to have an adjournment debate, or what is now Westminster Hall debate, which takes place in the Grand Committee room. And that gives you an opportunity to raise anything as a backbencher. And I think frontbenchers have also done it from a different angle if they need to do that. So some of the whips also can apply for adjournment debates if there is an issue in your constituency. So, for example, I'm getting fobbed off by a minister about something really simple, like putting disabled access into a railway station. The station can't be accessed by people with disabilities or parents with prams. You have to walk up these staircases to get across the platform. And I've written about 4 letters, and I'm now hoping that I'm going to get an adjournment debate. The minister's offered a meeting, a tea room drop-in, which means 5 minutes. And somehow, I know there's money, so it's not a question of money. And it's actually a question of having a more equal society, and which is why I'm pushing it. So that's one of the issues that, and what I've learned in this job is it's persistence. You just have to keep going. You just have to keep asking the question over and over again. And sometimes it sounds really boring, but usually they cave in. And that also goes for the council, my local council. I've measured it, and in about 2 years, they've caved in, like a signal control crossing. And they seem like not the sort of thing that an MP should get involved in, including fly tipping and all sorts of things. But my view is, if people feel they have nowhere to go, if they don't feel they have a voice, if there isn't anyone who's going to help them or answer their question, then they lose faith in democracy. And I feel that's part of my job, to let them know that as a democratically elected person, that I want to respond to their issues, even though it may not be my role. And we are stymied slightly because we don't have this massive budget for our staff to do every single thing, every single piece of casework. And my view is, as a lawyer, I'm not there to give advice. There are plenty of agencies when the cuts haven't happened, and there are lawyers who will be able to help people to give them advice. So to save me, and I don't know if other people do, some other MPs actually do the casework, like down to the nitty gritty of actually giving advice, which I feel that as an MP we shouldn't do for all sorts of liability reasons. But we can nevertheless take their cases up. But there are people out there who will be able to do that, and people sometimes don't know the difference, which is why I think it's vitally important to start in schools, to speak to the kids, about the children, about exactly what goes on in Parliament. And one of the things that I wanted to do, and I said I'd do it in the first term, I hope I have done, I have kept a grid of it, is to visit every single school in my constituency to make sure they know who I am, and we talk about it. What I like to do is a much more engaged way, which is to give them a topic for a debate, and to chair the debate for them, and then take questions afterwards. But the questions range from how much do you earn to have you met the Queen, the former, when she was alive, now the King. But the most trickiest one was the Debating Society, which said, do you agree that King Charles should be king? And I had to tread a very careful line as to why I don't think people should just be given the job. And there are other places which do elect their heads of state to whether we should, what we have as our second chamber. And you know, it's interesting to hear that there should be more Christian people, and as a Roman Catholic, Lords Spiritual are sitting in the Lords, and I keep reminding people there's only us and Iran who have spiritual people who are sitting in our legislature, and I feel there is a role for experts, but it's got to be a different kind of makeup. I'm straying on different things, but that is something that these are things that vex us all the time. So we are talking to people, we do move forward on different topics, but at the end of the day, there are 650 of us in a very special privileged position to be able to hear from people right at the grassroots level. And we are the bridge to government, we are the bridge to policy. We have in the Labour Party something called the Parliamentary Committee, where the leader of the party comes to sit before us. We are elected by our peers, our backbench peers. And one of the issues I love telling people about, that I used to talk to people in the constituency about, was the bedroom tax. And it's the sort of issue you can raise with the leader, and Ed Miliband actually took it up, and as a result of that we had a policy that we would abolish the bedroom tax previously. So it is such a privileged and unique position where you hear from people sometimes at their most vulnerable, and to be able to turn that into something useful. And I'll give you, and examples always help. I'll give you two examples. An elderly lady wanted to renew her blue badge, and she couldn't, I can't work the email, so she wrote to me a handwritten note. I don't use email. I got a fob off from the council, and I said, well, this is what you said happened. This didn't happen. I wrote back, and then they sent someone round to see her, because everything apparently now is on email in Walsall Council. But they did send someone round to see her. And I think if I hadn't written that second letter, and then she sat there and she wrote a letter back to me to say thank you, to say someone turned up and she's now got her blue badge for 3 years, so she doesn't have to do that. And it'll range from that to a young woman who came and just sat in front of me at my surgery, alone, without any support or anything else, to tell me her story of how she worked in the DWP. And she was helping they call them clients and customers, who stabbed her. And it's been years, 6 years, I've been to various ministers, and for whatever reason, whatever your views, what she wanted was for him to be deported. And we have tried and tried to do that. And one of the really good ministers actually started the deportation, but she nearly died, actually serving her constituency, serving her country. She was a public servant, and she felt that her voice wasn't heard at all. And so as a result, I had an adjournment debate, and we're now getting to the stage where we'll see where that takes us. And that brought that back to me because of what happened in Nottingham and what the family said. And I wish we could go back to that. And I think this younger generation do love each other, do care for each other, and they do look out for each other. And I think that's why I feel very optimistic about the future. And I loved what the parents said, and the outpouring of support for the young people who lost their lives, without having to be very dispassionate about the circumstances of the person who actually did kill them. And that's why it's so difficult. And that's why politics isn't just black and white. It isn't just this person did something, so they're horrible. It's understanding that and understanding why they did it, and trying to do something to change policy, the way we look at things, the way we speak about it, the way we speak to each other about it, we in the House and people outside, the discourse we have outside, using the fourth estate, the media, how we all talk about what happens. And and for those of you who have been watching what happened yesterday, people think that it's just a parliamentary thing, it's a Westminster bubble thing, and it is. And sometimes I turn away and I think, well, how is this helping my constituents who actually have to go to a food bank tomorrow? And I went to the food bank on Friday. How does it help those people who are now taking part in the Windrush celebrations? How does it help them trying to understand what happened to them? And why they haven't got their compensation, why they feel like second-class citizens in a place where they came over and didn't know anybody, and just basically put the country together after the war, whether they were doctors, nurses, carpenters, plumbers, they did all sorts of things. And so I hope the lessons that we take from everything that's happened, I hope we take those forward, and people don't feel that politicians are liars, cheats, don't tell the truth in Parliament. I hope there is some kind of understanding and debate that the majority of us try and do the best we can. And for me, it's representing the people in Walsall South and making sure that I can help them, having come from a background where you feel that you don't know anybody, you don't have any kind of networks, you don't have any, you're not part of the establishment, and things happen to you, and you don't want it to happen to anyone else, and I suppose that's what drives you. And I always end, and I hope you don't mind me ending on this, that I think we will get to a more equal society where women and men are treated in exactly the same ways. People don't look at us and say, we can't do this job, we can only do certain jobs. People with disabilities are treated exactly the same as everybody else. We make adaptations for them, we make circumstance allowances for them. People who don't necessarily have a background, and this is where it's sort of coming through, people who don't have a background where they are academic, and we value everybody and we give them the training, and it's lifelong learning, and that people don't have to make the choices of whether they have to do a job or whether they're there for their children at the end of the day, and being there for their families at the start and at the end. So yeah, it is a privilege, it is a unique job, it's a hard struggle for me, it was a hard struggle to get to the position I'm in as an MP. It took me kind of like, I always say it took me 30 years to get here. You start off young and enthusiastic, and then you realize that, yeah, it's quite good. And that's my circumstance, quite good to have done something else and to get into Parliament and to use those skills in Parliament and hopefully to change things and society for the better. Thank you very much, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Valerie. And I'm sure if we were doing this in person, it'd be a standing ovation for just how much rich detail you managed to fit into that talk. So thank you ever so much for sharing. I'm going to open it up to questions. I mean, I know I've got a lot, but I will put those to one side, and hopefully some of you in the audience will have questions you want to ask of Valerie. Or if you, oh, yes. Okay, Paul, over to you.
Valerie, how you doing? Hopefully sounds okay here. Listen, that was a great talk. Thank you very much. I have two questions here for you. One that one of the A-level students have raised this many times. I know the Tories back in 2010 tried for a few seats where they had open primaries for selecting their candidates. What impact do you think that would have upon the ability to represent if there are open primaries to select candidates within the constituencies rather than the party managers? The second question would be, even any instances that you've had, or do you think in recent years, is it much harder to carry out the mandate model of representation versus the delegate? Just for instance there, I mean, for a lot of, I know just from the Tory backbenchers, the issue of fracking, we're not in the manifesto, or it was in the manifesto it wouldn't happen, but being asked by the whips to do something that you feel maybe is going to be detrimental to your constituency, how do you deal with that, especially in this 24-hour media cycle, and how your constituents or party managers would react? Thank you.
Just going to open primaries. I think if you asked the Tories, because they've done the open primary selection, and anyone can turn up. And in fact, I was talking to Dan Jarvis today about, he just mentioned something to me. I'll just go back to I think Sarah Wollaston was elected under an open primary, and I think the party managers thought she was quite a handful. And it's such a difficult thing, because I don't want to get, I don't, so it's a slightly different model. I don't know what model they use, but it's a slightly different model to the one that they use in the US, where you have to say whether you are a Democrat voter or a Republican. But it's not a route I think I'd want to go down. I think if you talk about Labour Party members, and we have quite a democratic process in the sense that it's changed. So we used to have a situation where we had a general management committee, and actually anyone could be a member of the general management committee. I remember someone telling me that they used to drag people off the street, make them members, and then get them to come into the general management committee and vote for the person to become the MP. And that's how they did it before. It's moved with John Smith when he moved the one member, one vote, which I think was a much more democratic way. But it actually is much harder, because effectively what I had to do when that happened was I had to go round to every single member, and basically it was like expressing to them why I should be selected. So it was like an election to members. And then we had a hustings at the end. And sometimes they said they'd support me. Sometimes they said that they'd have an open mind. But you could, it was exactly like an election. And you have people who participate really well in Labour Party meetings, and some people who don't participate at all, but still want to be members. And that was a good thing, because you actually go round to people and you speak to them. But that only helps people who are able to do that. Are they in the kind of work that they that enables them to leave and just, you know, stop and then go and speak to every member? What if you're a woman with young children in a different type of job? So it does, each system seems to exclude people. What I was alluding to with Dan Jarvis, so he said to me that John Glenn, he attended an open primary where John Glenn and Victoria, I can't remember her surname now, one of the Victorias, were both candidates, and John Glenn won. And you think about the people who attend Labour Party meetings, you think about the people who are interested in politics. I know there are more women now, more young people now, but you just wonder what sort of, whether they would see, and it took a long time for people to see, that women could also be MPs. And as a result of that, more women came forward. So the open primaries worry me, because you can still pick people that, you know, when you put them against your party candidate, you don't want to pick the best one for the party. And it worried me that Dan Jarvis could also be part of the primary when we know what Dan Jarvis, that Dan Jarvis supports the Labour Party, is a Labour Party member. Your question about fracking. So I hope that, as I said, we stand on our manifesto, and that can change. Like the economic situation changes, so we have to adjust some of our policies on the basis of what the economic system will be. On that fracking vote, so you're expected, if you signed up to be a Labour Party member, to abide by the manifesto, and you would vote a certain way. I don't know about the way how heavy-handed the whips were to the Tory party, but normally, if there is an issue that relates to your constituency, you would have that conversation with the whips beforehand, and you can either be somewhere else, or you're allowed to vote against. And if it's in a very, very important issue in your constituency, the fact that they had to manage more than one person was a slightly different problem. But to me, it shouldn't happen too often, because you have a settled manifesto, which then becomes party policy. So that should have been the policy. People hear all sorts of things, and I suppose that happened in the olden days, and it's much harder when you have a minority government, or if you have a coalition government, or and if you don't have a majority at all. But I think when they had such a big majority, it shouldn't have mattered if people wanted to vote as their constituency wanted them to vote. And so I think it was a mishandling, and it could be it was the naivety of the whips, or their lack of experience. And I'm aware that it was a new prime minister at the time, so it was a bit kind of last minute. But I don't know what the conversations were with the Tory party then.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Valerie. I'm conscious that I promised we'd finish by 5 o'clock. So I'm going to suggest that if you do have more questions, you can either email them to Oliver, his contact details are online, or you could write a letter to Valerie and she'll get back to you, I'm sure. Or you can continue the conversation on Twitter using the Political Studies Association handle, which is PolSoc Association. And please do consider joining us, or encouraging your students to join the association as well, especially if they go on to undergraduate study. The association not only organises webinars and resources for school teachers such as yourselves, but we have academic conferences and events and specialist groups who are active throughout the year. So I just want to say a massive thank you again to our two speakers who have taken time out of their busy schedules to share some insights related to today's theme. And hopefully you've all got something to take away back into the classroom when you're next teaching these topics. I'm just going to quickly ask David Carr, who's the representative here for the Parliamentary Education Service, whether he wants to say anything on behalf of PES before we wrap up. David?
Thank you, James. And yeah, can I just echo what you said, Valerie? That was a superb talk and gave us a real insight into how things work in practice. And to those of you who would like to give your own feedback to both speakers, we'll send around a feedback survey. We'd be really grateful if you could fill that in. And there's a section in there which will ask you for your ideas about future topics for these seminars. So we'd love to have your input on that. But thanks again to both Oliver and to Valerie for such a wonderful seminar.
Brilliant. And then obviously the final thanks as well goes to all of you for joining us at the end of a busy teaching day. All right, so lovely to see you all, lovely to see our speakers. Please take care and have a lovely summer holiday when it arrives.
There's a hand up from Simon.
Oh, I think he's clapping. He's clapping, Valerie. Even better, even better. Yes, so have a lovely holiday, everyone, when it comes.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.